Have you ever noticed how rarely we talk about grief in our society? It's one of those universal experiences that somehow remains shrouded in silence. We all face loss at some point in our lives, yet when it happens, many of us feel utterly unprepared and alone. Welcome to today's conversation, where we're breaking that silence and diving into the complex world of grief, not to provide quick fixes or platitudes, but to explore what healthy grieving actually looks like beyond the often superficial advice we typically receive. The journey through grief isn't linear, and contrary to popular belief, it doesn't follow neat, predictable stages that you can simply check off a list. What if I told you that many of the commonly held beliefs about grief are actually hindering your healing process? Stay with me, because by the end of this video, we'll explore some rarely discussed truths about grief that might completely change how you view your own experiences with loss. Let's begin by acknowledging something vital. Grief is not a problem to be solved, but an experience to be honored. When we lose someone or something significant, whether that's a person, a relationship, a job, or even a version of ourselves, we don't simply get over it. The idea that grief has an expiration date is one of the most damaging misconceptions in our culture. Instead, grief becomes integrated into our lives. It changes shape, intensity, and expression, that it doesn't simply disappear with time. Consider the experience of Sarah, a woman who lost her husband of 30 years. 5 years after his death, she still keeps their shared rituals alive. She still talks to him sometimes. During the holidays, she still feels his absence acutely. Is this abnormal? Many would say yes, but research tells us otherwise. Continuing bonds with those we've lost is not only common, but can be a healthy part of grieving. The goal isn't to sever the emotional connection, but to find new ways to carry it forward. What's particularly challenging about grief is its unpredictability. You might be having a perfectly normal day when suddenly, the scent of a particular cologne or a song on the radio triggers an overwhelming wave of emotion. These grief ambushes, as therapists often call them, can be jarring and disorienting. But they're not signs of regression or failure. They're normal fluctuations in the grieving process. Our brains are wired to form associations, and these unexpected reminders simply show how deeply that person or experience was woven into the fabric of your life. Many people describe grief as coming in waves. At first, these waves crash frequently and with tremendous force. Over time, they may become less frequent, but even years later, a particularly powerful wave can still knock you off your feet. This is normal. The intensity might catch you by surprise, but it doesn't mean you're stuck or failing at grieving. I think it's important here to pause for a moment. If you're finding value in this conversation and want to explore more topics that don't get the honest attention they deserve, please consider subscribing to this channel and hitting the notification bell. Each week, we dive into these rarely discussed aspects of human experience, offering perspectives you might not find elsewhere. Subscribing supports the continuation of these important conversations. Now, let's address something rarely acknowledged. Grief affects us physically, not just emotionally. During periods of intense grief, you might experience disrupted sleep, changes in appetite, difficulty concentrating, or even physical pain. Your immune system can become compromised. This isn't weakness or exaggeration. It's your body responding to significant stress. Too often, we expect ourselves to function normally while grieving, which only compounds our suffering. I remember speaking with Michael, who lost his sister to cancer. 6 months after her death, he was still struggling with chronic fatigue and brain fog. His doctor found nothing physically wrong, leading Michael to believe he was simply failing at coping. What he didn't realize was that his body was manifesting his grief, a completely normal response that needed acknowledgement and care, not judgment. This leads to another crucial point. The pressure to grieve correctly can be immensely harmful. Our culture seems to have unwritten rules about grief. Don't cry too much, but don't appear unmoved. Return to normal activities quickly, but don't forget the deceased. Move forward, but don't seem to be moving on too fast. These contradictory expectations create a bizarre performance pressure at a time when authenticity is most needed. In reality, there's no correct way to grieve. Some people process loss through tears and emotional expression. Others become quiet and introspective. Some need to talk about their loss constantly, while others prefer to process internally. Some find comfort in rituals and mementos, while others prefer creating new patterns. None of these approaches is inherently better than others. They simply reflect different temperaments and coping styles. What matters most is finding grief expressions that feel authentic to you. This might mean quietly journaling your thoughts, creating art that expresses your feelings, or establishing rituals that honor your loss. It might mean seeking community through grief support groups, or it might mean processing more privately. The key is to resist the pressure to grieve according to others' expectations. This leads to an important consideration: the social dimension of grief. Have you noticed how support often disappears long before the grief does? In the immediate aftermath of a loss, people typically rally around with food, desserts, and offers of help. But after a few weeks or months, that support tends to evaporate, even though the grieving person's need hasn't diminished. Part of healthy grieving involves being honest about your continuing needs and learning to ask for specific support. This might mean saying to a friend, "I'd really appreciate having dinner together on the anniversary date," or "Could you come with me to this event that I'm dreading attending alone?" Most people want to help but don't know how. Clear requests guide them toward meaningful support. It's also worth considering that different types of losses bring different grieving experiences. Society tends to create hierarchies of grief, giving more validation to certain losses than others. The death of a spouse or a child typically receives strong acknowledgement, while other losses, miscarriages, estrangements, divorces, friendship endings, pet deaths, or even major life transitions, often don't receive the same recognition, despite causing genuine grief. These disenfranchised losses can be particularly difficult because the grieving person doesn't receive adequate social support or permission to fully acknowledge their pain. If you're experiencing grief that others don't seem to understand or validate, know that your feelings are legitimate regardless of external validation. Grief is a response to attachment and loss, not a response that needs to be justified to others. Perhaps most importantly, healthy grieving doesn't mean eliminating pain. It means learning to carry it differently. There's a profound difference between being consumed by grief and being accompanied by it. With time and intention, most people find that grief becomes less of an overwhelming presence and more of a companion that walks alongside them. This transformation doesn't happen passively. It requires active engagement with your grief, feeling it fully when it arises rather than suppressing it, finding meaning in your experience rather than just enduring it, and gradually reconstructing your life around the reality of your loss. This might involve establishing new traditions, exploring new aspects of your identity, or finding ways to honor what you've lost while still embracing what remains. Many people describe grief as ultimately becoming a teacher, painful, yes, but also profound in its lessons about resilience, impermanence, and the depth of human connection. As difficult as the journey is, grief often becomes a catalyst for significant personal growth, deeper empathy, and a greater appreciation for life's fragility and preciousness. As we come to the end of this exploration, I want to leave you with this thought. Perhaps the most courageous act in grieving isn't getting over it, but allowing yourself to be changed by it, to let your loss become part of the landscape of your life. Neither minimized nor all-consuming, but integrated into who you are becoming. If you found this perspective helpful, please consider giving this video a like and subscribing for more conversations that dive beneath the surface of human experience. I'd also love to hear your thoughts on grief and loss in the comments below. What has your experience taught you? What misconceptions have you encountered? Your voice adds depth to this important conversation. Before you go, check the description below for resources on grief support and ways you can support this channel. Until next time, remember that your grief deserves honor, your pain deserves acknowledgement, and your healing deserves patience, however that unfolds for you.